I note in the ACE Act, so I'd like to get your thoughts on this, that it looks like even in the ACE Act, the penalties are higher on a state and local party that violate the rules, but the penalties are higher than they are on a foreign national who violates the rules. Do you think that's right?
And I'm not familiar with that particular provision, Congressman, but I mean, the fact of the matter is these state and local organizations have a hard enough time paying any FEC enforcement fees or anything like that. I mean, it's very difficult for them. They don't have much money to begin with. And so I think the punishment should be reflective of the infraction. And I think oftentimes it's not.
And I think that's true, and I think you touched on this in your opening as well. A lot of times, particularly with the local party officials, they're just doing the best job they can. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some kind of a sanction if they violate the rules, but it ought to be rational and based on what their mental state was and whether or not it was something they were doing to play games, to try to do things they weren't supposed to do, or whether it was a mere fact that they just didn't understand and it was confusing. Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing. This morning's hearing will examine the very serious and growing problem of prescription drug shortages. Americans need more reliable access to life-saving drugs. According to the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, we currently have over 247 active drug shortages. Dr. Sardella, can you repeat for us, I think this was in your testimony, what percentage of the generic drugs are manufactured in facilities that have received an FDA warning letter? Yeah, turn your mic on.
1 out of 4 prescriptions in the United States over the last 26 months.
So roughly 25%.
Correct.
And over how many months?
The last 26 months.
And some of those FDA warning letters stay open for years, do they not?
That is correct. And the industry is less able, due to low margins, to be able to address them. And so their options are shutter, not comply, or continue to operate.
And let's talk about not compliance, because while some of these warning letters may be on things that folks back home might think are trivial and so forth, but there was an open warning letter on the New England Compounding Company at the time that they produced a sterile injection, which cost, I believe it was 38, 40 lives, several of whom were in my area. My district was impacted by that outbreak. And that was a warning letter because people were trying to cut costs. Well, one of the things that we got into downstairs, and you never have enough time to get into everything when you only get 5 minutes of questions, but one of the things we got into was the fact that we're heavily reliant on China and heavily reliant on India for the API to make the medications in the United States. Most of it's coming from Asia. And part of the concern was that we do such a job on inspecting American manufacturers and holding them to a high level, but then we don't do inspections overseas. And so not only is it cheaper from a labor standpoint, but it's also, you're not likely to have as many inspections from the FDA at your overseas locations. Doesn't that force our manufacturing offshore and make it more difficult for us to supply medicines for Americans?
I've had the privilege and experience of working in both China and India in my private and academic life. We inspect in India and hold India to the same standards as we do the U.S. We've had a problem in China the last several years, as you well know. And during the pandemic, there was also difficult to get to India during times of surges. But in general, we're holding India the same standard, and as we're allowed back into China, we'll do the same thing there.
Well, but should we be allowed back into China, and will they let us back into China? I mean, one, I don't know that we want to be dependent on China. Two, under their interpretation of their laws, your inspections may now be a crime in China. So why do we continue to think that that's our answer?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Secretary Granholm, are you aware that China reportedly permitted or began construction on coal units equivalent to about 2 coal-fired power plants per week in 2022?
They are the world's largest emitter.
And they're building more coal plants. That's correct, is it not?
That's correct.
And I surmise that last year's renewed construction, based on the reports that I've read, is likely in response to grid failures that China experienced last summer due to heat and drought, especially after today's EPA announcement of its newest crackdown on fossil fuel plants. What are we going to do in our country to mitigate coal and natural gas power plant closures and ensure that America doesn't fall prey to grid failures like China did?